Hello again. Welcome to another edition of Media Watch. I'm your co-host, Eric Tate.
I'm Raymond Peterson.
I'm Bob Anthony.
And I'm Alan Singer.
Educator, historian Alan Singer plopped down amidst three longtime journalists of different ages. We're doing this recording on what would normally be the last day of February 2024, but since it's a leap year, that means we're recording it on the 28th of February on a Wednesday, which hopefully it'll air next Monday on Manhattan Neighborhood Network, but we'll make sure it's up on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, places like that. So this is the day after there was a primary in Michigan for the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. We'll get to that. But there's a whole lot of stuff breaking across the way in the Mideast. There's still that conflict, I put it mildly by saying conflict. And interestingly enough, the New York Post went after a bunch of high school students because they had the quote temerity to actually try to put in perspective what was going on between Israel and Hamas in the Mideast. And Alan, you brought to our attention how despicable the New York Post was in trying to go after those kids. Why don't you give us that background on that story? Because I think what I read, those kids were more nuanced and more judicious and more empathetic than any of the pundits I have read thus far. Go.
Look, Stuyvesant High School is one of the top high schools in the United States. Academically, students have to take very rigorous examinations to attend Stuyvesant. They have a student newspaper, which is actually independently operated from the school. There's a faculty advisor, but the student editorial team decides what gets posted. And what the students decided was to open up their website and their newspaper to students at Stuyvesant who wanted to respond to events that were taking place in Gaza, both the attack on Israel, but also the bombardment and decimation of Gaza. Mm-hmm. Well, what the Post did is it looked at one of the articles. It was an op-ed piece that was published in the most recent issue, and it was published anonymously. I assume because the student who wrote it was concerned that they could be blacklisted in their college applications because that's what's going on right now. Right. And what the student did was raised a couple of very important points. The student wrote, call it what it is, genocide, apartheid, ethnic cleansing. For 75 years, Palestinians have been victims of blatant crimes against humanity as the rest of the world turns a blind eye to Israel's atrocities. And what the student argued is that Gaza was off the radar despite Israeli treatment of the people of Gaza. And what the student said was that Muslims have to stop apologizing for Israeli suffering and have to condemn what Israel has done as the oppressor for the last, since 1967. Now, the Post said, well, the Stuyvesant did not present other views. It only presented this. Now, whether I agree with the student or not, I thought it was a very well-argued piece. Mm-hmm. But the reality is that the Stuyvesant newspaper opened it up to a lot of different points of view. Principally, on its website, one student wrote, but exacerbated my pain was that I saw many Stuyvesant students posting on social media justifying the terror attacks. This was written by a student who had a family living in Israel. Mm-hmm. Another student writes, one of the bigger misconceptions and common knowledge is that Hamas equals all Palestine. This is not accurate. What we have are student journalists who are much better journalists than the supposedly professional journalists at the New York Post.
Yeah, what I read when you sent those links, those kids historically knew what it was about. They dissected arguments from both sides. They presented what they felt and how they felt, how it was impacting them without being making the other students the other in terms of not being empathetic to the fact that there's pain happening on both sides. And the arguments came from both sides, from what I read, and much better, much more nuanced and better written than most of the stuff I'm seeing in mainstream press and non-mainstream press these days that supposedly passes for journalism.
What I saw was really balanced, and the Post, whoever wrote that for the Post, either didn't bother to look or just flat out ignored it just to make that point in that story, which is not good journalism at all. If I was the advisor to those students, right, I'm there not to be the overseer to tell them what to think, just to keep them from going off the rails and, you know, doing something flat out illegal. The journalism I saw there was stellar in the balance, because that was the point of the entire package, to get, you know, views from both sides, moderating views, and just get the full package of ideas off the student campus. And they did a really good job. The Post, in its ignorance, decided to ignore all of that.
Mm.
Yeah, but you know what? Why are we surprised by that? Because the New York Post is a Rupert Murdoch-owned rag, okay?
Yes.
And so, Alan, the other example of how the rag can twist and distort things was another stellar example. What's the other headline that you can share with us? This one coming from which?
This is the Wall Street Journal, which attempts to present itself as a legitimate newspaper. And it had a report on Dearborn, Michigan, where it accused the people of Dearborn of being America's jihad capital. And that's a quote, America's jihad capital, because imams and politicians in Michigan City side with Hamas against Israel and Iran against the US.
That's a quote.
That's a quote. To question US policy, to question Israeli policy, the questioning, that becomes anti-Semitic and anti-US, that becomes jihadist, and that is virulent in attack on thinking.
Now, if Alan, I believe the mayor of Dearborn, which is a large Muslim population, said on TV and in the press that people in his town were frightened after that article because they were afraid from backlash, and you know, for a while they were, you know, they wanted more police protection of mosques and whatnot. So this was bad. You know, it was an op-ed, wasn't the Wall Street Journal's official opinion, but still, here myself as an editor, as a copy editor too, copy editors write the headlines, and that headline said the jihad capital of the, you know, of the U.S., and that's bad.
Why would the paper allow such a headline? Even though it's an op-ed visiting editorialist writing whatever they're writing, they still have to control that headline to get the viewership for the piece, correct?
As the copy desk chief, your job is to make sure it's not blown, you know, an overblown headline like that. I mean, I've been on the copy desk, like at the Daily News, so I know I know how it goes. And that headline got past all the eyes, and that's the big problem.
That is crazy. Now, we understand that Rupert Murdoch outlets tend to be that way.
Which the Wall Street Journal is.
Yeah,
Which,
and New York Post, Wall Street Journal, they kept trying to say that there's a war between Murdoch and these papers. Well, we already know that. That's a non-existent war. And so,
well, as we said before, as we were talking before we went on the air, I mean, the Wall Street Journal is fraying at the edges, but the New York Post is toilet paper. I mean, it's just, you know, it's just not what the old Dorothy Schiff New York Post was ages ago.
yeah, how about that? Yeah, and the bottom line is, the Murdoch folk, whether it's Fox fake news, okay, can easily slip into non-journalistic propaganda. Not easily, that's usually their stock in trade. You're right about the Wall Street Journal fraying now, because at one point, even when he first took it over, it tried to maintain a balance of real news coverage and held up for a while. But you're right, it's about down the toilet like the rest of the Murdoch properties. But Michigan, of course, was in the spotlight because the primary was held when we're taping. It was yesterday. When the show airs, it was last week, whenever. And so because Rashida Tlaib and a bunch of other folk did a last minute press to have their primary voters vote uncommitted, I believe that was the phrase they wanted to use, uncommitted, correct? They put a last minute press so that Joe Biden would get a message that he has not been doing right. His administration has not been doing right about the Palestinians, not just in the United States of America as voters, but the Palestinians in Gaza that are suffering all this death and destruction by his, as they say, one-sided support of Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli government, even as more death and destruction continues to rain down on the Palestinians in Gaza. I believe the conservative estimate is 29,000 civilians, 29,000 people, whether it's civilians and Hamas terrorist fighters, have now been killed in Gaza. That's the unconfirmed, because every time they give you a figure, they say, as noted by the Hamas health ministry, and they say that as if the health ministry is telling you a tale in propaganda, and they may be exaggerating. I suspect there may be an undercount. Nobody says there may be an undercount. They always imply it's an overcount. And what will happen when they total up all this death and destruction? They find out that it truly is an amazing undercount. What are they going to say then, right? So, but the message from the voters, what was the number, Alan? How many voted?
Over 100,000 people in Michigan voted uncommitted.
Mm-hmm.
And the Democratic Party better see that, because in 2016, Trump won Michigan by 16,000 votes. 2020, Biden won it by 150,000 votes. That 100,000 votes can be the difference between having a Democratic president in 2024 or Donald Trump. And to be honest, Netanyahu seems to continually undermine the Biden policy and would prefer Trump. It's like we're letting a foreign power dictate American elections because the Biden administration is unable to address what's happening in Gaza.
Yeah, you got no, I'm not correcting anything you said, Alan. That is exactly what's happening. And the story I read pointed out the fact that the uncommitted coalition at the last minute were able to get 100,000. They're now talking to Democrats in Wisconsin and urging them to join the uncommitted vote movement in their primary, which, that's going to be next Tuesday or March 12th. I forget when the Wisconsin primary is, but it's sometime in the next 10, 12 days. And so this uncommitted movement in the primaries may begin to grow if the administration doesn't change its stance as far as trying to rein in Netanyahu and all this death and destruction. There were a couple of other media stories that we were supposed to be looking at because there was a guy who was brought up on charges for hacking a Tucker Carlson feed when Tucker was doing his thing in his visit to the Soviet Union a week and a half ago. I don't remember the name of the freelance journalist, but he was actually charged, correct, Bob?
Sorry, he was charged, And the question in all of our minds is, did he gain access to the Tucker Carlson video material legally? Did he either steal a password or get handed a password that was stolen, or somehow got access to what he shouldn't have had access to? If that's the case, he has a problem. If it was a public feed, then that's another issue because he'd probably be protected. But I believe the FBI went and did some ransacking, visited his house, and so did it go to that level? Is the question. I mean, was the crime to the level that you needed that kind of a response? So a lot of questions in here. None of it, all of it, gray.
Yeah, I should have actually left that story up so we could tell folks who he was.
I might pull it up while you're chatting.
What the charges were, because the FBI said that it was an unauthorized access and that the unauthorized access was facilitated by illegal activity or something to that effect, which is where the gray area is. Is he a journalist? Is he another Julian Assange, who, as far as I'm concerned, was not a journalist, even though he called out some things that needed to be called out, but he also put a whole bunch of folks at risk and at jeopardy, may have cost people their lives. And so I have no problem with them going after Julian Assange and trying to extradite him, put him on trial, and let the American people pass judgment on whether he was, quote, doing a good job as a journalist or whether he was putting people's lives in danger and deserve
what if he was a Daniel Ellsberg?
Yes, if he was Ellsberg, totally different story. But Ellsberg made sure that he was not releasing things that would put American assets in jeopardy put their lives in danger. Assange just threw stuff out there, didn't care who might have gotten hurt, what collection sources may have been jeopardized, et cetera, just because he had a trove of stuff. And there seems to have been some kind of connections, collaboration, communication with Russian assets pertaining to that trove of documents. And so that's why they want to try him. And I don't blame them. Okay, if you think you got evidence that he's colluding with a foreign power to release your secrets, then yeah, that's good enough grounds to, especially if you lost people's lives, yeah, worth putting him on trial. This guy with the Tucker Carlson feed, I don't think he was putting anybody's lives in danger.
What did he do exactly?
Did he get the stuff with just good, hardworking journalistic digging, or did he break some laws to do it? And
Now,
that's
I have the Washington Post story up in front of me. The name of the journalist is Tim Burke, and he's a former employee of the Daily Beast and Deadspin.
Yeah, a freelancer for those platforms.
Yes, but in the indictment against Burke include conspiracy and wiretapping. Prosecutors allege that the journalist went too far by tapping into a streaming feed site where he acquired unbroadcast clips of former Fox News star Tucker Carlson and other personalities. Okay, so they're charging with unauthorized access
and other things. Yes.
Yes.
So they think they have good grounds and good evidence for that. Okay, that's probably why they invaded his house when it got to that wiretapping interception of the feed. Yes, okay, I can see that.
Yeah, but I'd like to know what Tucker Carlson edited out.
I don't care. No one. Speaking of Carlson, what we should have done was run a clip of Jon Stewart taking him down item by item for that Russian trip. I'm sure some of our viewers may have seen that, but Jon Stewart said, "Oh yeah, here's Tucker Carlson. He's pushing a grocery cart down through a Russian grocery store. Oh wow, what a pristine aisle. Oh, Tucker forgot that there are other things that make that aisle so pristine and those prices so low." And he proceeded to say, "There's no equating an autocratic dictator doing what he does to have a pristine aisle and a free society where people do what they want. And so, but if he were a journalist, he might have known that. But since he isn't quite a journalist, even though he said that's his title, oh, big note, lie about your profession. Jon Stewart did a great job dissecting Tucker Carlson's trip, but I was surprised when this other story popped up about somebody being charged with wiretapping his feed. Jon Stewart didn't wiretap. He just took his broadcast and then dissected it piece by piece, what aired. Anyway, speaking of journalists, the current president of ABC News, Kim Godwin, who used to be the chief of ABC News before she got demoted, they put somebody else in above her that she now has to report to. But in her job as president of ABC News, she had an internal memo to the division about how they were covering and could be covering Donald Trump. And part of the internal email memo talked about how egregiously racist Donald Trump's comments were to the conservative Black group that he addressed last week. I don't know the name of the group. One of you guys may have it somewhere on your desktop.
Black Conservative Federation.
Black Conservative Federation. Well, he was addressing that group and said, oh yeah, the blacks, this, you got to read the quote, the blacks love me. He's talking to the Black Federation, whatever group. And evidently, what did you say, how many blacks were in the audience, Alan?
Well, the group was on stage with him, but a lot of the people, the ticket was $100 to $500 per seat. So a lot of the audience were just white Trump supporters.
Okay, well, that's why he said the blacks, because he was talking to those white people in the audience. Evidently, the blacks now love me because I got indicted. Okay.
Sounds like Ross Perot and his old "you people" quote.
Yeah, that's it. The blacks, you people. Yes. Nobody forgot to pull his coat to say it's not the blacks, it's blacks or black people, but not the blacks. That makes them other.
Okay, and just to keep us on track, we have about 5 minutes left.
Yeah. So vis-a-vis the other media story that I think we at least should touch on, journalism. Richard Prince's platform that keeps tab of all these journalistics that came through my in-basket. And besides the Kim Godwin thing, there was another story about Don Lemon settling with CNN for $24.5 million. Turns out that that's what the extended salary would have been had he stayed with CNN for the rest of his 3-year contract or whatever. And so CNN has bought him out. Basically, they fired him, but he said, no, that was an unjust termination or something to that effect. So they were in negotiations, and the settlement came to $24.5 million, which is basically what the salary would have been. And then he immediately turned around and says, okay, I'll be on X, the Elon Musk platform. So what does that tell you about Don Lemon? If he's going to leave CNN or get fired by CNN, doesn't know what to do with himself, and he decides, oh, the guy, the billionaire, whose actions seem to point to the fact that he's leaning towards, where's he from? South Africa? Yeah, okay, right. Whose actions seem to point towards the fact that he seems to be somewhat racist.
And anti-Semitic.
Yeah, throw all that in. And we know for a fact that a judge found in favor of some Tesla workers out in California a few years back and actually gave them $153 million in damages because of all his racist treatment. And some other judge says, no, they don't deserve that, and made it 10 million or something, just arbitrarily. Just to show you. We remember that story here on Media Watch. Yeah.
To me, Don Lemon was starting to mature, starting to get someplace. I mean, I criticized him before for getting drunk on New Year's Eve and for a number of other things. But
I'm with you. We talked about how he ever got to where he got to, but started to grow into it. Yes, continue.
Started to grow into it. I mean, Ray, were you a regular Don Lemon viewer, or did you? I mean, any?
No, seldom. Didn't like. I never cared for him. Tell you the truth. Don't ask me why. I just didn't.
because he hadn't grown into it at the time. That's probably why.
That's probably it. That's probably it. Yeah, that might be it.
But go ahead, finish,
I
Bob.
was never a favorite of mine.
No, I mean that was my point. He seemed it took him a while to mature into it. It didn't seem, he thought he was better than he was.
There you go.
And there's a number of anchors I can say that about, but yeah, he had that issue.
Yes, and they're across the stream, all races, all creeds. A lot of them think they're better than they are.
Yes.
But anyway, we're almost out of time. How much time we got left?
Well, let me get the timer back. Whoops. We have about 2 minutes.
Yeah. We didn't do any Black History Month stories. The two quick mentions. There was a piece in the New York Times. I don't know if you guys remember the story back in World War I down in Houston, Texas. These Black soldiers were being harassed by the local population, and they got their guns, went into town. A whole big fight took place. Some people got killed, including some of the soldiers, some white people. So they had instant trials, and they actually convicted just about all those guys who went down there. They had
Over 150. It was over 150.
Yeah. And they tried, hung 13
Immediately, almost immediately after the trial. Yep.
Hung 6 more things. 19 were hung, right? And so
In total. Yeah.
back in November, there was a story about the fact that the Department of Defense said those guys were unfairly tried. They should not have been, whatever. Well, this month, they actually exonerated them, said the trial was unfair. They planted new headstones in the Sam Houston Cemetery, Federal Cemetery, Moorhead, sir, and had a ceremony to rectify for the descendants of the people. And so, it's just like, what can I tell you?
They did not have legal representation at their trials.
Right. Yeah. They had an officer, an Army officer, as their legal representation, but he was not a lawyer.
He had some legal training.
He had some legal training, like maybe he read a law book once.
So, as one descendant said,
it was a sham. It was like it's been happening to our people since day one.
It was a
Okay,
legal lynching.
and with that, we're about out.
So anyway, at least they rectified it for those Black soldiers. So thank you for joining us, folks. This has been Media Watch. I'm your co-host, Eric Tait.
I'm Raymond Peterson.
Alan Singer.
And Bob Anthony. Catch up to us on YouTube at Media Watch. I'm sorry, yes, on YouTube at Media Watch EVT.
And we'll catch you the next time, folks.